Hello everyone, please tell me. Which city are you listening from? What time is it there? The first time I noticed her, I didn't think much of it. It was just a brief glance, a fleeting silhouette in the window across the street. The window was partially covered by heavy curtains, but through the gaps, I could just make out the shape of someone standing there. At first, I thought it was just the shadow of a tree swaying in the wind. But then, I realized the silhouette was too defined. It wasn't a tree. It was a person. I remember staring at the window for a while, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The rain had been falling steadily all day, its rhythmic tapping against the window pane, lulling me into a quiet trance. It was the kind of weather that made everything feel muted, like the world outside was wrapped in a soft blanket, muffling all sounds and movements. There was something comforting about it, almost like the world had paused for a moment. But this figure, standing so still in the window, didn't fit into the calm. The longer I looked at her, the more my stomach churned with unease. She wasn't moving. The curtains shifted slightly with the wind, but she remained frozen, staring out of the window, her back to me. It was as if she was waiting for something or someone. For a few minutes, I couldn't pull my eyes away from her. There was a peculiar stillness to the scene, like everything around us had been caught in a moment that was somehow both fragile and unnervingly permanent. I remember wondering why she hadn't closed the curtains or moved away from the window. I tried to dismiss it as nothing more than a trick of the light, or maybe just my overactive imagination. But the feeling that something wasn't right lingered gnawing at me. And then, without warning, she was gone. One moment, she was there so clear, so still, and the next, the space was empty. I blinked, confused, thinking I must have imagined it. I shook my head, half laughing at myself. It's just the rain, I thought. The shadows playing tricks. I turned away from the window, dismissing the strange encounter as nothing more than a moment of tiredness or overactive thoughts. But as I walked through the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The house seemed quieter than usual, the air heavier. I tried to focus on other things, distract myself, but my mind kept drifting back to that window. I couldn't stop thinking about the figure I'd seen. The way she stood there, unmoving, as if waiting for something I couldn't understand. Later that evening, as nightfall came, I found myself drawn back to the window. The rain had stopped for a while, leaving the world outside still and dark. The streetlights cast soft, golden halos in the puddles below, and the night felt unusually calm, almost serene. Yet, something within me stirred an instinct, a deep-set unease that I couldn't ignore. I approached the window again, my heart beating just a little faster than normal. And there she was. This time, I couldn't see her as clearly, but I knew she was there. I could feel her presence, like a shadow looming just behind the curtain. My breath caught in my throat as I stood there, staring at the faint silhouette through the fabric. I waited. I wasn't sure what I was waiting for, but my feet felt rooted to the floor, as if I couldn't move even if I wanted to. And then, in the quiet, I heard something. A whisper, soft and barely audible, like a breath in my ear. It sent a shiver down my spine, and I turned, half expecting someone to be behind me. But there was nothing, just the silence. The kind of silence that's so thick it presses against your ears. I swallowed, my throat dry, and turned back to the window. But when I looked again, she was gone. Just like before, vanished without a trace. I couldn't understand it. I stayed at the window for a long time that night, my eyes darting back and forth, scanning every inch of the street. I convinced myself it was just the darkness playing tricks on my eyes, the shadows merging with the night. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. Something had shifted. The next few days were the same. I would catch glimpses of her in that window, always there, always still, but as soon as I focused on her, she would disappear. It was like she existed only when I wasn't looking directly at her. It became a strange routine, one I couldn't shake. I found myself waiting for her to appear, hoping for some kind of clarity, some explanation for what was happening. One evening, as I stood by the window, watching the rain begin to fall again, I felt an overwhelming urge to do something I hadn't done before. I wanted to speak to her. I wanted to understand why she was there, why she never moved, why she always vanished. But the moment I thought about moving toward the door to the outside, something changed. The air around me grew colder, and a soft, unexplainable chill crawled up my spine. The world outside seemed impossibly quiet, almost as if it had forgotten how to make a sound. My hands trembled as I reached for the door handle, but then I froze. Something in my mind told me not to go outside, not to cross that threshold. I don't know why. Instead, I stayed at the window, watching her. And, just as I had done every other time, I waited for her to disappear. But she didn't. She stood there, unmoving, her presence growing heavier, more intense with each passing moment. I felt like I was drowning in the stillness. My heart raced, and my pulse hammered in my ears. I knew I should turn away. I knew I should walk away from that window, forget about her, and never think about it again. But I couldn't. I couldn't tear my eyes away. And then, something strange happened. She turned, slowly, deliberately, as if she had been waiting for me to notice. Her head tilted slightly to the side, and though I couldn't see her face clearly, I felt the weight of her gaze. It was like she was looking into me, not at me. I held my breath, my chest tightening. It felt like I was suffocating, but I couldn't move. Then, in the distance, I heard something. A voice, a whisper, soft and distant, like it was coming from far away, though it sounded so close it might have been in my ear. "I'm waiting," it said. I blinked. The moment I looked back at the window, she was gone. But this time, I didn't feel the relief I had before. Instead, I felt a deep, gnawing emptiness inside me, like something essential had been taken. I couldn't explain it, but I knew I hadn't imagined it. She had been there, and she had been waiting. Since then, I haven't seen her again. But sometimes, when the rain falls, when the world feels too still, I catch myself staring at that window. And when I look away, I feel as if she's still there, waiting. I don't know who she was. I don't know if she'll ever come back. But I wonder if she's still watching, still waiting for something or someone at that window, just across the street. And I wonder if, one day, I'll be the one she's waiting for. It was a rainy afternoon when I first noticed the woman in the library. The kind of day when the world outside feels muffled and distant. The sky draped in thick, gray clouds that seemed to press down on everything. The library, a quiet and old building with rows of tall, dusty shelves and the faint scent of paper and wood, was almost empty except for the usual few who came in to study or browse. I was sitting in my usual corner, the same spot by the window, trying to finish a book I had been meaning to read for weeks. The rain outside pattered gently against the glass, the sound blending with the soft rustle of pages turning. She peered out of nowhere. One moment, I was reading, lost in the words, and the next, I noticed her standing near the entrance, looking around with a sense of hesitation, as if she wasn't quite sure where to go. She was tall, dressed in a dark coat that reached her knees, her long hair cascading over her shoulders. There was something odd about her presence, something that made the air feel just a little heavier, as if the library itself had sensed her arrival. At first, I thought she was just another visitor, someone new to the library. She didn't seem to fit the usual crowd, the regulars who would settle in for hours with their books, or the students with their backpacks, their eyes glued to their laptops. This woman was different. She stood still for a moment, looking at the rows of books with an expression I couldn't quite read. It was almost as if she was searching for something, but not sure what. I tried to go back to my book, but the feeling of her presence lingered. There was something unsettling about the way she moved. Her steps were slow, deliberate, as if she was afraid of disturbing the silence. She wandered deeper into the library, past the rows of fiction, and towards the aisles of history and philosophy, where fewer people lingered. I glanced up from my book, trying not to stare, but there was something about her that caught my attention. Her movements seemed almost too careful, too deliberate, as if she was trying to avoid drawing attention to herself. But despite her efforts, it felt as if she was already the focus of the room, a quiet tension filling the space around her. I told myself it was nothing, that I was just imagining things. People come and go all the time. But as I watched her disappear into the rows of books, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I didn't know what it was, but I could sense it, deep in my gut. Minutes passed. I continued reading, but I kept glancing toward the aisle she had walked into. She didn't reappear. I thought maybe she had simply chosen a book and sat down somewhere, though it was odd that I hadn't heard the faint sound of a chair scraping or a book being opened. The library was so quiet, the kind of silence that feels almost too quiet, where every small sound feels amplified. I didn't think much of it at first, but after about 20 minutes, I started to wonder. Where was she? I had seen her walk down that aisle, but now the area was empty. The bookshelves stood silent, the same as they always did, but there was no sign of her anywhere. No footsteps, no rustle of clothing, nothing. The library, normally a place of calm and stillness, suddenly felt too silent, too still. Curiosity got the better of me, and I stood up. I walked towards the history aisle, passing through the rows of books with an uncomfortable feeling creeping up my spine. The library seemed unusually empty now, the few people who had been around earlier nowhere to be seen. It was just me, the books, and the unsettling quiet. I reached the end of the aisle where I had seen her last, but she was gone. There was no sign of her anywhere. I glanced around, trying to see if she had moved to another section, but the rows of books remained undisturbed. I thought maybe she had left the library, though I couldn't recall hearing the door open or the soft chime that usually signaled when someone exited. I went back to my seat, feeling uneasy. I told myself I was overreacting, that I had simply imagined her presence, that it was just the gloomy weather playing tricks on my mind. But even as I tried to focus on my book again, the unsettling feeling lingered, nagging at me. It wasn't until later that evening, when I was preparing to leave, that the mystery deepened. I had spent hours in that same corner, my eyes flickering nervously to the aisles now and then, expecting to see her reappear, but she never did. As I walked to the door, I passed the front desk. The librarian, an older man with glasses perched on his nose, was behind the counter, filing some papers. I noticed a couple of patrons leaving the library, but there was no sign of the woman. I hesitated for a moment before speaking up. "Excuse me," I said, my voice soft. "Did anyone leave the library recently?" A woman. Tall, dark coat, long hair. The librarian looked up from his papers, his brow furrowing. "No," he said slowly, his voice low. "I don't think so." "Why do you ask?" "I saw her earlier," I said, trying to sound casual, but my voice trembled slightly. "She was walking around, but I never saw her leave." The librarian's face remained neutral, but something in his eyes shifted just the slightest flicker of unease. "You're sure?" he asked, his voice slightly more measured now. "Yes," I said, nodding. "I saw her walk in, but after a while, she was gone. No one else saw her." The librarian didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked around the library, his gaze lingering on the empty aisles. "No one else has mentioned her," he said finally, "and there's no record of her checking in. We keep a log of all visitors, you know." He paused, as if considering something, and then his eyes met mine. "Strange thing, though," he said in a low voice, almost as if he were speaking to himself. "I don't remember anyone entering after the storm started. We've been closed for an hour now." I felt a chill run down my spine.
"What do you mean?"
The librarian didn't answer right away. He just gave me a knowing look, one that sent a ripple of unease through me. "I suppose," he finally said, almost in a whisper. "Some people come into places like this, and they're never really seen again." I left the library that night, my mind spinning with questions I couldn't answer. I kept thinking about the woman in the dark coat, the way she had appeared so suddenly, and how she had vanished without a trace. No one else had seen her. No one could find her. To this day, I can't explain what happened that afternoon. But every time I walk past that library, I can't help but glance up at the windows, hoping, or maybe fearing, that I'll see her standing there again, waiting for someone to notice. It was just another quiet evening, the kind that always felt too still, as if the world had forgotten to make any noise. I was walking home from the late shift, the air heavy with humidity, a storm that hadn't yet arrived. The streets were empty, save for the occasional car driving by its headlights, painting long thin shadows along the sidewalk. The streetlights flickered every few moments, casting fleeting ghostly light on the pavement. They were old lights, the kind that hummed with that low, almost comforting sound, but every time they flickered, the darkness would wrap around the street a little more, a little tighter. I was lost in my thoughts, my footsteps the only sound accompanying me as I made my way down the street. The rain hadn't started yet, but the air felt charged thick with the promise of something that hadn't quite happened. My mind wandered maybe about the job or the mundane tasks waiting for me at home, but when I reached the corner of my block, something caught my eye. One of the streetlights flickered. It wasn't unusual for the light to stutter, but this time it seemed different. The flicker was more pronounced, like it was struggling to stay on, and for just a brief moment when the light dipped into darkness, I saw someone standing under it. It wasn't a person I recognized. They were standing perfectly still, their posture rigid and unnatural, as if they were waiting for something or someone, though there was no one else around. At first I thought it was just another late-night passerby, maybe someone waiting for a cab or trying to find their way home, but as the light flickered back on, I realized they were too still, too out of place in the quiet of the night. The figure was tall, wearing a long coat that seemed too thick for the warm air, the fabric almost blending into the shadows around them. Their face was hidden either by the shadow of the flickering light or by something else, something I couldn't quite see. But the strangest part, what sent a chill down my spine, was the way they were positioned. They weren't facing me directly, yet somehow I could feel their eyes on me, even without seeing their face. I stopped walking, unsure whether to keep moving or to stand there and figure out what was going on. The street was completely silent now, no distant sounds of passing cars or rustling leaves. Everything was still, unnervingly so. Then the streetlight flickered again, casting a fleeting shadow across the figure, and in that split second, I saw it. I saw the movement, just a slight shift of the figure's arm, a motion that was too deliberate, too calculated. It was like they were drawing my attention, waiting for me to notice. I felt the cold grip of unease twist in my stomach. My instinct screamed for me to turn and walk away, to ignore whatever I was seeing, but my feet felt heavy, reluctant to move. It's strange, but when you're in situations like that, the body sometimes moves slower than the mind. I stood there, locked in place, my eyes glued to the figure, and then, just as quickly as I had seen them, they vanished. It wasn't a sudden disappearance, but more like they blended into the shadows, their form fading out of existence. I blinked, hoping it was a trick of the light, some visual glitch, but when the light flickered again, there was no one there. The space was empty. I didn't know what to think. Maybe it was some late-night prankster, or maybe I had imagined it, the lingering fatigue from my shift playing tricks on my tired mind. But something about it didn't sit right. I walked a few more steps, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. My heart pounded in my chest, my pulse quickening as I glanced back over my shoulder. The street was just as it had been before, empty and dark, but there was something unsettling in that quiet, like the night itself was holding its breath. I didn't look back again until I reached the entrance to my apartment building, my hands shaking slightly as I fumbled with my keys. As the door clicked open and I stepped inside, I thought I heard something, just a faint, almost inaudible sound coming from the street. It was too soft to make out, but the thought lingered in my mind, gnawing at me. The next morning, the sun rose as usual, casting light on the street in a way that made everything seem ordinary again. I tried to push the memory to the back of my mind, chalking it up to exhaustion, the kind that makes the world feel like it's bending in strange ways. But when I passed that same streetlight later that week, I couldn't help but glance at it, my eyes instinctively scanning the shadows beneath it. It was just another ordinary evening, the kind where the rain never comes and the street feels a little too quiet. But as I walked past the lamp. I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, just for a moment, a figure moved in the corner of my vision, standing beneath the light. And then just as quickly they disappeared. It was one of those days when everything felt ordinary, yet the tiniest details kept gnawing at the edges of my perception. I had just finished my work at the office and was heading home, a routine that usually required nothing more than a few autopilot-like steps. Grab my bag, check my phone, put on my jacket, and head out the door. The streets were bustling as usual, the familiar hum of city life swirling around me, horns, honking people, talking, and the occasional sound of a train rattling past in the distance. I walked the same route I always took, through the busy downtown area, and down the quiet side streets that led to my apartment. It was a crisp autumn evening, the air smelling faintly of damp leaves, and the promise of rain that never quite came. I passed the same storefronts, the same cafes, and the same group of people waiting at the bus stop, their faces so familiar, yet unremarkable. As I walked, I noticed someone ahead of me on the sidewalk, a man. He was tall, dressed in a deep green coat that seemed too thick for the mild weather. His face was partially obscured by the collar of his coat, and he was walking briskly, almost as if he had somewhere important to be. I wasn't paying much attention to him, just another stranger in the sea of people, until something caught my eye. It wasn't anything overt, no sudden movement, no strange gesture, but something about his presence felt off. Like he didn't quite fit in. I shrugged it off. Maybe it was just the long day messing with my head, making me more aware of things that usually wouldn't have crossed my mind. I passed him without a second thought, but as I continued down the street, I noticed him again, a block ahead of me. Same height, same walking pace, same thick coat. The coat now looked more brown than green, but I dismissed it as a trick of the fading light. Maybe I had just mistaken the color the first time, or maybe had switched coats. At some point it wasn't unusual to see someone change outerwear when the temperature fluctuates. I quickened my pace, thinking that it was simply a coincidence, but as I turned onto the next street, there he was again, closer, this time standing near a corner store. Now his coat was completely different. It was a faded blue, frayed at the cuffs, like it had seen better days. The same man, but somehow everything about him felt wrong. The way he stood there so still, his hands tucked into the pockets of the coat. His face remained partially hidden, just like before, but something about the way he held himself made me uncomfortable. It was as though he was waiting for me to notice something that I wasn't meant to. I stopped in my tracks. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, a wave of unease washing over me. Was this some kind of strange coincidence? It couldn't be. How could I have passed the same person 3 times, yet their clothes kept changing? I shook my head and tried to brush the thought away. I must have been overtired, my mind playing tricks on me. The streets were busy after all, and it was probably just someone who happened to look similar to the man I had seen earlier. I was making connections that didn't exist, I told myself, but as I continued walking, the nagging feeling in my chest wouldn't go away. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see him again, but I didn't. I tried to focus on my surroundings. Trees swaying in the wind, the hum of passing cars, but the man's image was burned into my mind. I couldn't shake the idea that he was still out there following me, shifting his appearance as he moved through the city. By the time I reached my apartment, I had convinced myself that it was just my imagination. I had passed plenty of people on the street that evening, and I had simply missed the details. It wasn't that strange, right? People wear different coats, they change their outfits and they blend into the crowd. It was nothing to worry about, but as I stepped into my apartment and closed the door behind me, I caught a glimpse of something. In the corner of the hallway mirror, the same man. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. He wasn't standing directly behind me, but his reflection was unmistakably too, with a coat that looked almost black now, though I could still see the faint green of the previous coat underneath. His face was hidden in the same way it had been on the street, but I could feel his presence as if he were standing just a few inches away. I quickly turned around, my heart hammering in my chest, but there was no one there. The hallway was empty, the only sound, the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I stared at the mirror for what felt like an eternity, trying to convince myself that I was imagining things, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew it wasn't my imagination. That night, I barely slept. The image of the man haunting the edges of my consciousness. I kept expecting him to appear in the corner of my room or outside my window, watching me with those hidden eyes. But he never did. The next morning when I left for work, I walked the same route, my eyes darting nervously from side to side. I couldn't help it, kept looking for him, wondering if he'd be there again, wearing a new coat, standing still, as though he were waiting for something. I didn't see him, not that day, not the next. I tried to push it from my mind, but something about the way he had appeared and disappeared, always changing, never staying the same, kept me on edge. Weeks went by, and eventually I stopped thinking about the man. The memory of that strange night faded, buried beneath the usual routine of life. But every now and then, when I pass a street corner or a familiar store, I catch myself looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see him again, his clothes different, his face hidden, waiting. And sometimes, just for a moment, I wonder if I'll pass him again, and if I do, what will he be wearing this time? It was the sort of day that felt like it belonged to another Timian, of those afternoons where the world seems to slow down, as if everything was caught in a kind of stillness. The rain had started earlier, soft and persistent, a blanket of gray that muted all sound except for the soft pattering against the pavement. The streets were wet, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and old stone, and everything around me had that quiet, almost forgotten feeling. I had been walking for a while, lost in my thoughts, my umbrella barely holding up against the wind that tugged at it from time to time. I wasn't in a rush, just wandering through the unfamiliar neighborhood, trying to find my way back to where I was staying. I had only just arrived in the city a few hours ago, and the place seemed both charming and alien, with its narrow winding streets and old buildings that looked like they had stories to tell. I had been trying to get to a small cafe, one I'd seen on a map earlier. It was supposed to be a nice place, a quiet spot for coffee, but as I walked I realized that I had no idea where I was. The streets kept twisting, the buildings starting to look eerily similar, and soon I had lost track of how many turns I had taken. I didn't mind so much. There was something calming about the rain, something that made me feel like I was suspended in a moment outside of time. But after a while I realized I had wandered far off course. That's when I saw her. She was standing by the corner of an old bookstore, wrapped in a dark coat, her hood pulled up, and her posture was so still, it almost seemed as though she were part of the building itself. Her presence didn't seem unusual at first. She was just another passerby, someone waiting for the rain to stop, or perhaps lost like I was. But something about her made me stop. Maybe it was the way she was looking at me, as if she had been waiting for me to notice her, or perhaps it was the strange sense that I had seen her before, though I knew I hadn't. I hesitated for a moment, unsure if I should approach, but the feeling of being lost made the decision easier. I walked toward her, the rain seeming to soften even more with each step. I took as I got closer. She tilted her head slightly, and I thought I saw a flicker of something in her eye. Something almost familiar yet unsettling. "Excuse me," I said, hoping she could help. "I'm trying to find the cafe on Broad Street. Do you know how to get there?" She nodded, her expression calm but distant. Without a word, she gestured toward a narrow alleyway that led off the main road. "Just take the second left," she said quietly. "It's a straight walk from there. You can't miss it." I was relieved it was a simple enough direction, and with her words, a small weight lifted from my chest. I thanked her, feeling strangely reassured. She didn't say anything else, just stood there watching me as I turned and walked down the alleyway. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, the air now thick with the smell of wet stone and moss-covered bricks. I took the second left, just as she had said. The alley was narrow, winding, with old streetlights flickering overhead. There was something strangely eerie about it, but I didn't mind. Nothing felt overtly threatening. As I walked, I noticed the buildings were getting older, their facades worn as if they had been abandoned for years. My footsteps echoed in the narrow space, that sound strangely amplified by the heavy silence around me. It didn't take long to reach the end of the alley, and as I stepped into a small courtyard, I couldn't believe my eyes. There, right in front of me, was the same cafe I had been looking for. It was cozy, with a warm glow spilling from its windows and a small wooden sign swinging gently in the wind. I couldn't help but smile, relieved that I had found it at last, but as I stepped inside and ordered my coffee, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The cafe was quiet, almost too quiet. There was no one else inside, except for the barista, who gave me a brief smile before turning away to prepare my drink. I sat by the window, watching the rain fall outside, the familiar hum of the cafe around me, but something lingered in the back of my mind. When I finished my coffee, I decided to leave. As I stepped out into the courtyard, again something strange happened. I looked up at the street signs, trying to get my bearings, but I realized I was standing at the same corner where I had started, exactly where I had first seen the woman. At first I thought I had simply made a wrong turn, that maybe the street I had walked down had looped around and led me back to where I began. I glanced down at my watch. Only 10 minutes had passed since I had entered the cafe. But the strange thing was, when I looked around, everything seemed the same. The buildings, the alleyway, the distant streetlights, all of it. It was as if I had never left. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. It must have been a mistake, I told myself. I had simply lost track of where I had been walking, maybe wandered in a circle without realizing it, but the feeling that I had somehow crossed some invisible line, one that shouldn't have been crossed, was growing stronger. The woman was still there, standing by the bookstore, watching me with the same distant gaze. This time I felt a shiver run down my spine as I walked toward her, drawn in by some invisible pull. She didn't speak, just nodded slightly when I approached, as though acknowledging my confusion. "Didn't you want to get to the cafe?" she asked, her voice as calm as ever. I nodded, my mind racing. I just came from there. I'm not sure how, but I ended up back here. She tilted her head, the faintest trace of a smile on her lips. "It's easy to get lost in these streets," she said, her voice low, almost like a whisper, "but you'll find your way if you follow the right path." Her words felt like a warning, but I couldn't understand why I felt drawn to her, compelled to listen. But the unsettling feeling was growing inside me, a deep sense that something wasn't right. I turned back, walking the same route once again, the alleyway leading me toward the cafe, but this time when I reached the end, there was no cafe, the buildings were different. Now older, their windows broken, their doors sealed with rusted metal. The familiar warmth of the cafe was gone, replaced by the cold, empty silence of the alley. I turned around, my heart pounding in my chest, and when I looked back down the street, the woman was gone. The only thing left was the echo of her words in my mind. I don't know how I ended up back where I started, or why the streets seemed to loop in on themselves like some kind of maze I couldn't escape, but I know one thing for certain. Every time I find myself walking in that neighborhood now, I see the same figure watching me from the shadows. And no matter which way I turn, I always end up in the same place. It was the kind of evening that made the whole world feel suspended in time, where the air was cool and thick with the smell of rain that hadn't quite arrived yet. I was walking along the road, the streetlights casting long golden pools of light onto the wet pavement. It wasn't late, just past dusk, but the streets were already quiet, almost unnaturally, so I had wandered far from my usual route, exploring the older parts of the town where the buildings were aged, their stone walls weathered by time, and the streets seemed to belong to another era entirely. The old church was nestled at the end of a narrow street, its silhouette a dark figure against the fading light of the sky. It wasn't a church I frequented. I'd passed by it countless times, but had never thought much of it. It was an old structure, the kind you'd see in pictures of forgotten towns, with a worn bell tower and ivy creeping up its sides like something from a forgotten fairy tale. But that night there was something about it that caught my attention. I had no intention of going inside. In fact, I wasn't even sure if it was still in use. I had heard whispers over the years about how it had been abandoned, the doors locked up tight, the windows boarded, but as I approached, something seemed different. The heavy oak doors that had always been shut tight, as far as I could remember, were slightly ajar. The space between them was narrow, just wide enough for someone to slip through. A faint light flickered from within, a dull yellow glow that contrasted with the muted gray of the evening. It beckoned, though I couldn't explain why. I paused for a moment, my feet frozen in place, unsure of what to do. Something about the scene felt apt to quiet, to still, but I couldn't ignore the strange pull to step closer. My curiosity outweighed any instinct to turn back. I reached out and gently pushed the door, the wood creaking under my touch. The door swung open slowly, the light from inside spilling out into the dim street. Inside, everything seemed normal. At first glance, there was no grand spectacle, no eerie presence, just the ordinary sight of an old church's interior: dusty pews, a high vaulted ceiling, and faded stained glass windows that looked like they hadn't been cleaned in years. The air was musty thick, with the scent of old wood and stone, but there was nothing inherently sinister about it. It looked just like any other abandoned Plasbergaden, with the passage of time slowly taking its toll. But there was something wrong, something subtle that gnawed at the edges of my thoughts. The light that had drawn me in, where was it coming from? I looked around, scanning the room, but there was no obvious source. The flickering glow that had seeped from between the doors now seemed to be coming from every corner, a strange, ambient light that filled the space without any clear origin. It wasn't the steady, warm glow of a candle or a lamp, but something softer, like the light of a memory or a dream. I stepped further into the church, the floorboards creaking under my weight, and yet with each step, it felt like the air grew colder the deeper I walked. The more the silence seemed to press in on me, suffocating in its stillness. There were no sounds, the usual hum of the town outside, the distant voices or car engines, was as if the whole world had been swallowed by this place. I stopped at the center of the room, standing under the arches, feeling strangely exposed, as if the very walls were watching me. And then, as I stood there, something shifted. It wasn't sudden, but it was unmistakable. I felt it in the pit of my stomach. A feeling of being observed, but not in the way you feel when you're simply being watched. This was something deeper, something ancient. It was as if the church itself was alive, its stone walls and wooden beams breathing, waiting. I turned slowly, hoping to see something. Anything that would make sense of the unease settling in my chest, but there was nothing. The pews were empty, the altar untouched, and yet the longer I stood there, the more the air seemed to thicken. It wasn't just cold anymore, it was oppressive, like something pressing down on my chest. I glanced towards the altar, but my eyes immediately flicked back to the door, snow fully open behind me. They hadn't been like that when I entered. I was certain they had been only slightly ajar, but now they were wide open, and the light from outside seemed sharper, more real. I hadn't heard them move, hadn't felt any wind, but there they were, standing wide, inviting me to leave. I hesitated, but then, almost without thinking, I started walking toward the door, my feet moving faster than my mind could catch up. I passed by the pews again, my heart pounding in my chest. But this time something caught my eye just for a second. In the corner of the room, there was movement, quick, but unmistakable. A shadow darting across the stone floor, too quick to be anything natural. My breath caught in my throat, and I froze for a moment, staring at the place where I had seen it. But when I looked, there was nothing. I took another step, then another, my feet carrying me toward the open doors, as if my body knew something my mind didn't. The air around me felt thicker, the silence louder, and I could almost hear the sound of my own pulse pounding in my ears. I reached the doorway, and as I stepped back out into the street, I turned one last time to look at the church. The door slammed shut behind me, with a force that sent a jolt through my body, the sudden sound of it rattling through the quiet evening. But the strangest part, what truly unsettled me, was that as I stood there staring at the door, I realized something. There was no light coming from inside anymore. The church, once glowing faintly with that strange ambient light, was now completely dark, its windows black and uninviting. It was as though nothing had ever happened. The door was closed, the church was empty, and the light that had drawn me in was gone. I turned away, my mind racing, my heart still thumping in my chest. I walked back down the street, but the feeling of the church, that strange, oppressive presence, stayed with me. I couldn't shake it, couldn't explain what had happened inside, and to this day, I can't. Every time I pass that church, it stands there silent and dark, just like it was before. I wonder if the door will open again, or if I will find myself walking inside, drawn by that strange light, only to find nothing waiting for me. The old church stands there, untouched by time, and I can't help but feel that it's waiting for something, for someone to step inside again, and when they do, it will be just like it was before, empty, silent, and waiting to close the door. It was late. The house was quiet, save for the occasional creak of the wooden floorboards beneath my feet. As I moved about, the day had been long, filled with the haze of meetings, errands, and the kind of mundane tasks that had left me feeling tired, but not quite ready for sleep. It was the perfect kind of evening for a solitary routine, just me and the quiet hum of the world outside. I had gone into the bathroom to wash up, the soft, warm light from the lamp above the mirror reflecting off the surfaces in a calming way. I leaned over the sink, splashing my face with cool water, trying to wake myself up a bit before bed. The mirror in front of me was large, framed with dark wood, and I had always found it oddly comforting. It had been there since I moved into the house a few months ago, and I'd never given it much thought. As I stood there, hands resting on the edge of the sink, my reflection stared back at me, the familiar face I knew so well. I could feel the weight of the day starting to lift as I rinsed off the last of the soap and looked up into the mirror, but then something shifted. At first I didn't quite notice it was subtle, just a flicker, something I brushed off as a trick of the light, but when I blinked and looked again, my breath caught in my throat. In the reflection just behind me, a face had appeared. It wasn't mine, I was certain of that. The face was pale, its features distorted in a way that made me uneasy. The eyes were wide, dark, and unmoving, staring directly at me through the glass. The face was almost as if it were suspended, hovering just behind my reflection. The hair was long and tangled, hanging around the face like something you'd see in an old photograph. My pulse quickened as I froze, unable to move. For a moment I thought it was just a shadow, a trick of the light, maybe a reflection from the hallway or something that had passed by outside the bathroom window, but the face didn't shift. It remained there, unnervingly still, staring at me. I slowly turned my head to look over my shoulder, half expecting to find someone standing behind me, but there was nothing. I was alone. My heart began to pound in my chest, my breath coming in shallow bursts. I turned back to the mirror, my eyes wide now, searching for any explanation, but there it was again, the same face, still as stone, hanging just behind mine in the reflection. I couldn't explain it. I was the only one in the room. The house was empty. I hadn't heard the door open or the floor creak beneath someone else's steps, and yet there it was, this face trapped in the reflection, a ghostly image that didn't belong. I took a step back, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. I had to be imagining it. Maybe it was the exhaustion, the strain of a long day, making my mind play tricks on me. But as I looked again, the face seemed to lean closer, its eyes growing darker, more hollow. It was as though it was moving closer to me. With every breath I took, I slammed my eyes shut, shaking my head, trying to push the image away. When I opened them again, the face was gone, just like that. It had disappeared, leaving only my reflection in the mirror, calm and undisturbed. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. It was ridiculous. There was nothing there. I was just tired, probably imagining things in the dim light of the bathroom, but I couldn't shake the lingering feeling, that sensation of being watched, of something unseen lurking just behind me. I glanced over my shoulder once more, but nothing was there. I turned off the tap and wiped my face with a towel, trying to settle my nerves. Maybe I was just too tired. Maybe I'd been staring at the mirror too long, and my mind had started to play tricks on me. I laughed softly to myself, trying to convince myself that it was all just a figment of my imagination. But as I stepped away from the sink, I couldn't help but glance back at the mirror one last time, and that's when I saw it again. The face, it was back, but this time it was even closer. The reflection in the mirror was clearer, the features more defined, the iced hosts, I swear, staring directly at me, wide open, almost too wide, as if they were seeing something I couldn't. I staggered back, my breath hitching in my throat, unable to tear my gaze away. The face was there just behind mine, its hollow eyes locked onto me, and in that moment, it was clear this wasn't some trick of light or an illusion. This wasn't a reflection at all. It was something else, something that shouldn't have been there, and it was getting closer. I turned to run out of the bathroom, but the moment I stepped away from the mirror, the sensation of being watched grew unbearable. I couldn't shake it, feeling that the face was following me, that it was somehow still there, even when I wasn't looking. The house felt different now. The air was thicker, as though the walls were pressing in on me. I hurried down the hallway, my heart Racing, I reached the door, but just before I stepped out, I caught a glimpse of myself in the hallway mirror for a split second. I thought I saw the face again, standing just behind me, its eyes still wide, its lips stretched into a grotesque smile. I turned quickly, but there was nothing there. And when I looked back at the mirror, I was alone again, just me standing in the hallway, but something had changed. I couldn't explain it, but the house felt heavier now, the silence louder, as though the reflection wasn't just in the glass anymore, it was in the very walls of the house, in the corners of every room. The next morning, when I woke up, the sun was shining, the world outside was calm, and everything seemed to have returned to normal. But the memory of that face lingered, creeping in during moments of quiet, when I passed by mirrors, or when I stood alone in a room and I realized something, Thina thought, that chilled me to my core. I wasn't sure if the face had ever really been in the reflection at all, or if it had always been there, following me, waiting for me to notice. It was a bright Saturday afternoon when I decided to take a walk through the park. The kind of day where the sun felt warm on your skin, and the breeze was just cool enough to make everything feel peaceful. I had been feeling restless lately too, caught up in the rush of work and the noise of the world, so I thought a little time outside, surrounded by trees and the soft murmur of distant conversations, would help clear my head. I walked along the familiar path, passing the flower beds that lined the edges of the park. The air smelled faintly of fresh grass and the earthy scent of the trees. People were scattered around the park, sitting on the grass, chatting in small groups, or jogging along the trails. It wasn't too crowded, but there was just enough life to make it feel lively. I had no particular destination in mind, just letting my feet guide me as I wandered, aimlessly enjoying the sunlight and the way the world seemed to slow down in the park. As I neared the small pond that sat at the far end, I noticed a bench I'd seen 1,000 times before, tucked under a cluster of trees, shaded and serene. It was always empty when I walked by, probably because it was tucked away just out of sight from the main path, but today there was someone sitting there. She was a woman, maybe in her late 20s or early 30s. She had long dark hair that fell in soft waves around her shoulders. She was dressed simply in a light sweater and jeans, her feet tucked up beneath her as she sat, her arms resting loosely at her sides. I don't know why, but something about her caught my attention. Maybe it was the way she seemed so still, as if she were part of the park itself, blending into the background in a way that was almost unsettling. I hesitated for a moment, watching her from a distance. She didn't seem to notice me, her gaze directed straight ahead, fixed on something I couldn't see. There was something serene about her, but also something that felt distant, like she was lost in thought, far away from the world around her. I debated whether or not to approach her. I wasn't looking to start a conversation, but the curiosity in me won out. I walked closer, but just as I reached the bench, something odd happened. As if on cue, she shifted her position slightly, looking up toward me for the first time. Her gaze met mine, and for a brief moment, our eyes locked. There was a quiet recognition in her stare, but no words, no smile, just a long, lingering look that seemed to stretch on for longer than it should have. I felt my stomach tighten, like a strange chill had settled over me. I quickly looked away, trying to shake off the feeling. It was silly, I told myself. Just a stranger, nothing more. I continued walking, moving past her bench and heading further into the park, though I couldn't completely rid myself of the odd sensation that something wasn't quite right. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the feeling of being watched, even after I had passed her, lingered. I lost track of time as I wandered through the park, I walked around the pond, past the trees, and over to the playground, where children were laughing and running. It was calming, but something kept tugging at the back of my mind, the thought of the woman on the bench, her stillness, her gaze. It wasn't until I started heading back toward the entrance of the park that I realized how much time had passed. I was feeling more relaxed, the tension from earlier fading, but as I neared the small cluster of trees where the bench was, I slowed down, the thought of her again creeping into my mind. I looked over, expecting to see her there, sitting quietly like before. But there was no one. The bench was empty. I stopped in my tracks, blinking a few times to make sure I wasn't imagining it. The bench was there exactly where it had been before, but there was no sign of the woman. I looked around the area, scanning the space between the trees, but she was nowhere to be seen. Maybe she had gotten up and left. I thought maybe I had just walked past at the wrong moment when she had gotten up and disappeared into the park. But the strange part was that I couldn't remember hearing her leave. There had been no sound of movement, no rustling of leaves as someone stood. The whole scene just felt wrong. I walked closer to the bench, running my fingers along the wood as if I could somehow piece together what had happened. The bench felt just as it always had, solid, unremarkable, but for some reason it felt different now, like it didn't quite belong in the park anymore. I sat down on the bench, trying to shake off the unease that had settled in my stomach. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe she was just another person passing through, and I had gotten caught up in a momentary curiosity. But then, as I sat there, I began to feel something I hadn't expected, a soft, almost imperceptible pressure, as if something or someone was sitting next to me. I shifted uncomfortably, glancing around again. The park was still. The only sounds the rustling of leaves in the wind. I stood up abruptly, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't want to be here anymore. I didn't want to sit on that bench, to linger in that quiet space that suddenly felt so unnerving. I started to walk away quickly, my mind spinning with questions. Why hadn't I seen her leave? Where had she gone? Why did the bench feel so much like it had been changed? As I made my way back toward the park's entrance, I turned for one last look at the area. The trees stood still, the bench empty as ever. But then, just as I was about to turn away, I saw something that made my blood run cold. In the reflection of the park's pond, a figure sat on the bench. It was a blurry image, distorted by the ripples in the water, but it was unmistakable. Same dark-haired woman. Her face was turned away from me, but I could still make out the outline of her figure sitting there, still as stone under the shadow of the trees. I turned my head to look back at the bench, but it was empty. Again, I don't know what happened that day. I don't know if I imagined the whole thing, or if something truly strange occurred in that park. All I know is that every time I pass that bench now, I feel the weight of her gaze, even though she's never there. And sometimes when the wind picks up, and the air feels just a little too still, I swear I can hear the soft rustling of leaves, as if someone is sitting on the bench, waiting for me to notice. I had never been one to pay much attention to dreams. They always felt like fleeting thoughts, nothing more than the mind's way of processing the day's events. But there was something different about the dream I had the night before. It wasn't like the usual disjointed scenes, or the fragmented recollections I was used to. This dream felt real. It felt like I was living through something that wasn't just in my head. In the dream, I was walking through a small, dimly lit shop. The air smelled faintly of wood and something a little musty, like an old attic that hadn't been opened in years. There was an odd calmness to the place, though it made me uneasy. The shelves were filled with odd trinkets, jars of strange objects, and curious things I couldn't quite make sense of. The shop felt like it had been frozen in time, untouched by the outside world. It was a place that didn't belong anywhere, not in this time, or in any place I had ever seen before, but the oddest part was the feeling I had while walking through it. I knew in my dream that this was not a place I had ever visited in real life, yet everything about it felt familiar too. Familiar, like I had walked those aisles before. I was aware of a sense of déjà vu, the feeling that I had been here before, even though I knew I hadn't. The walls, the dusty wooden shelves, the faint light hanging from the ceiling, it all felt strangely comforting, and yet deeply unsettling. At the same time, I woke up abruptly, the dream fading quickly from my memory, as dreams often do, but there was one thing that stayed with meth's store. The shop lingered in my mind for hours. After I woke up, like a shadow I couldn't shake, it was a sensation I couldn't explain, as if the place existed somewhere waiting for me to find it. The next day I was out running errands, taking the same route I always took with no particular destination in mind. I had forgotten about the dream by then, or at least tried to, but as I turned down a side street that wasn't part of my usual path, I saw something that made my heart stop there. It was the same shop. At first I thought it was just a trick of the light, some illusion. But as I got closer, my breath caught in my throat. It was exactly like the one in my dream. Same weathered wooden sign hanging over the door, the faint flicker of light spilling out from behind the windows, the same quiet stillness in the air. It felt like I had stepped into my dream, as if the shop had somehow bled into the waking world. I stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. The logical part of my mind told me to turn around, to walk away, and ignore the strange sense of recognition that pulsed through my veins. But there was another part of me that was drawn to it, compelled to enter, to see if what was inside matched what I had seen in my dream. I pushed open the door, the bell above it ringing softly as I stepped inside. The air smelled the same, that faint mustiness mingling with the scent of old wood. The shelves were crammed with oddities, just like in the dream, yards filled with strange objects, old books with yellowed pages and trinkets that looked like they belonged in a forgotten era. The shop was small, and yet it seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction, as though the walls were somehow expanding beyond the limits of the room. I felt a sense of unease settle over me as I wandered further inside. Everything was exactly as I had seen it in my dream, from the crooked shelves to the dim light that barely illuminated the corners of the room. It was as if I had stepped into a version of the world where time didn't exist, a place where reality had bent and warped. I moved through the aisles, my eyes scanning the strange objects on the shelves, but I couldn't focus. My mind kept racing, the feeling of déjà vu growing stronger with each step I took. I tried to shake it off, telling myself that it was just a coincidence, that this shop was just an old forgotten place I had never noticed before. But I knew deep down that this wasn't just a coincidence, this was something else. As I turned a corner, I saw a figure standing behind the counter. It was an older man, his face obscured by the shadow of the dim light. He was wearing an old-fashioned coat, the kind that looked like it had come from another time, and he was staring at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. There was something about his gaze that felt both familiar and distant, as if he knew something I didn't. I opened my mouth to speak, to ask him if he knew anything about the shop, but the words stuck in my throat. He didn't say anything at first. Instead, he just watched me, his eyes narrowing slightly as if assessing me. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke. "I've been waiting for you," he said, his voice low and gravelly. The words hit me like a wave, knocking the breath out of me. I froze, unable to move or speak. My heart began to pound in my chest, the world around me growing dizzy and blurred. How could he know? How could he have known about the dream? I hadn't told anyone about it, not a single soul, and yet here I was standing in this shop, hearing these words that should not have existed in this world. I tried to step back, but my legs felt like they were made of stone. The shop seemed to close in around me, the shelves now to close the air, to thick. The man's gaze never wavered, his eyes piercing into mine. "You've come back," he said, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. "I knew you would." I turned quickly, desperate to leave, but the door was gone. It wasn't there anymore, the space where the exit should have been now, a solid wall of bookshelves. Panic rose in my chest as I spun around, looking for a way out, but the shop seemed to stretch and shift, its layout changing before my eyes. I was trapped, and then just as suddenly as it had begun, everything went dark. When I woke up, I was lying on the floor of the shop, the air heavy with silence. The shelves were gone, the jars and trinkets vanished, and the shop was completely empty. It was as if it had never existed at all. My breath came in sharp, shallow gasps as I stood up, my head spinning the room. Spinning with it, I stumbled out into the street, the sunlight blinding in comparison to the dark, musty air inside the shop. But when I looked around, there was nothing, no sign of the shop, no indication it had ever been there. Back at home now, trying to make sense of what happened. I don't know if I ever really left that shop, or if it was all just a dream, another layer of reality that folded into itself, pulling me along. But every time I close my eyes, I see that shop again, the man behind the counter waiting for me. And I know I'll go back. I have to. It's the only thing that makes sense. It was one of those late evenings where the world feels like it's holding its breath. The sky was a deep shade of navy, the air cool with a bite that made every breath feel sharp. I had just missed the last train to my destination, which wasn't the worst thing in the world, just an inconvenience, really. The train station was nearly empty, with only a few scattered passengers waiting by the gates, their faces illuminated by the dim orange glow of the overhead lights. The platform stretched out before me, long and quiet, the metallic scent of the tracks mixing with the sterile smell of the station itself. I had plenty of time to kill, so I decided to walk around and stretch my legs. The quiet of the station was oddly soothing, and I found myself lost in the rhythmic sounds of my footsteps against the polished floor. The only other noise was the distant hum of an old vending machine, and the occasional announcement crackling over the speakers, garbled and unintelligible. The station had a peculiar feel to it, empty, yes, but also unfinished, like something was missing. The walls, a faded beige, had a layer of grime that seemed to accumulate over years of disuse, and the benches were old, their surfaces worn smooth by countless passengers who had come and gone over the years. The entire place felt like it was caught somewhere between being in use and being forgotten, as if it had once served a purpose, but now lingered, neglected in the background of a world that had moved on without it. I wandered down the platform, my feet carrying me, with no particular destination in mind. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed softly, flickering occasionally, but for the most part the station was quiet, save for the soft murmur of far-off voices. Or at least that's what I thought at first. I stopped for a moment, unsure if I had heard something, if my mind was just playing tricks on me. The voices weren't clear, but they were there, echoing softly, faint and distant. I turned, looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see a group of late-night travelers coming down the platform, but there was no one. The station was still empty. I shrugged it off, attributing it to the hollow acoustics of the old building, or maybe the fatigue from the long day. I continued walking, passing the old ticket booths and the turnstiles, but the voices came again, closer, This time, sharper, more distinct, I froze. They were calling my name Eli. It was a whisper, at first, just a breath of sound in the vast emptiness of the station, but then, a second time, louder Eli. My heart skipped a beat. It wasn't a voice I recognized, but it was unmistakably calling for me. I turned around, my gaze sweeping across the platform, but there was no one there. The station was still. Empty, the flickering lights casting long distorted shadows across the walls. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, a chill creeping through me, despite the warmth of my jacket. I walked forward cautiously, my footsteps slow, as if I was afraid to make too much noise. I kept hearing me name calling out from somewhere deeper in the station, from the far end of the platform where the light grew dimmer and the shadows seemed to stretch longer. Eli. This time the voice sounded like it was right behind me. I spun around quickly, my breath caught in my chest. The platform was still completely empty. My mind was racing now. I had to be imagining things right. It was just the silence of the station playing tricks on me that had to be it. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Something was off, and I couldn't put my finger on it. I took a few more steps, moving cautiously down the platform toward the far end where the light barely reached. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. They were coming from the shadows, from somewhere ahead. My name drawn out like a question, like a plea, but the sound was distant and hollow, as if the voice was coming from somewhere far deeper than the station itself. Eli. I stopped, my eyes darting to every corner of the platform. The old metal signs creaked in the wind, their rusted edges groaning, as if they were trying to speak. There was something in the air, something thick and heavy, as though the station itself were holding its breath, waiting for me to move. Then I saw it. At the far end of the platform, where the light faded into darkness, there was a figure standing. I blinked, unsure if I was seeing things. The figure was just standing there, in the shadows, motionless. And for a moment I couldn't tell if it was a person or just another trick of the light. The figure was tall, too tall, and the way it stood made my stomach twist. I couldn't make out any features, no face, no clear shape, but I could feel its presence, the way it seemed to distort the air around it. I stood frozen for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest, and then I heard the voice again, this time closer, clearer. Eli. It was unmistakable now. The voice was right behind me, just at the edge of my ear. It wasn't just a whisper, it was a command, sharp and demanding. I spun around, but again, there was nothing there. The platform was completely empty, save for me and the growing shadows. I felt a sudden surge of panic. I couldn't stay here, not anymore. I turned to leave, but my feet felt like lead, as if something was holding me in place. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure at the far end of the platform. Though it hadn't moved, it was just standing there, watching me. The voice me nammering out again, louder this time, and I couldn't tell if it was coming from the figure or from somewhere else in the station. I backed away slowly, my breath shallow, my hands trembling. My mind was screaming at me to run, but my legs felt like they were frozen in place, trapped in some kind of nightmare I couldn't wake from. I finally forced myself to turn and sprint toward the exit. The sound of my footsteps echoing against the cold tiles. The lights overhead flickered again, casting strange broken shadows. And I couldn't shake the feeling that the station was closing in on me, that the darkness was reaching out, pulling me back into it. When I reached the exit, I threw open the door and ran out into the night, gasping for air. I didn't stop until I was halfway down the street, my legs burning from the effort, but I didn't dare look back. I could still hear the faintest echo of that voice, my name, calling out from the empty station behind me. I don't know what it was that night, whether I was truly alone in that station, or if something else was waiting there, something I couldn't see. But I know this, I haven't gone back since, and every time I hear a train pass through that old station, I still hear the faintest whisper in the wind, Eli. It was an ordinary evening, or at least it seemed that way. The streets were quiet, the kind of quiet that happens when the day's hustle and bustle fades into the calm of the night. I had just finished a long day of work, and was walking home, the air crisp and cool, a slight breeze rustling the trees along the sidewalk. It was one of those evenings where the world felt peaceful, almost serene, with nothing to disturb the stillness. I had taken the same route home countless times before. The street was familiar, with its old houses and streetlights casting pools of soft yellow light on the sidewalk. I walked slowly, lost in thought, my hands in my pockets, and my mind wandering. The evening was calm, and I enjoyed the solitude, letting the rhythmic sound of my footsteps carry me along. As I passed the corner where the old bookstore stood, something caught my eye, a figure. It was a woman standing just ahead on the sidewalk, her back to me. She was dressed in a long coat, dark and flowing, the kind that seemed out of place for the weather, though the chill in the air might have warranted it. Her hair was long, falling in waves over her shoulders. But the strangest thing was how still she was standing there, as if she was waiting for someone. I didn't think much of it at first. People waited outside on the streets all the time, especially near the bookstore, where others might be browsing or stopping for a moment to read. I kept walking, my pace steady, not thinking anything of it. But as I neared her, something felt wrong. I couldn't place it at first. There was an unease building in the pit of my stomach. Something about the way she stood, so perfectly still, as if the world around her had forgotten to move. I was about to pass her when, without any warning, she turned. At least that's what I thought at first. But no, she hadn't moved at all. The second her face came into view, I realized that she wasn't facing me at all. She wasn't facing the street or the bookstore. She was simply facing the space ahead of her, her gaze locked in a way that made me feel like she wasn't really seeing anything at all. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, staring straight ahead, as if she were waiting for something beyond the reach of my sight. I froze, an inexplicable shiver running down my spine. There was something eerie about her posture, something unnatural. She didn't acknowledge me, didn't move, and for a moment, I just stood there staring at her. And then, just as I was about to continue walking, she did something that made my heart race. She turned her head slowly, deliberately, and looked directly at me. I'm not sure why it struck me as so wrong, but the way her head moved, almost mechanically like a puppet on string set, wasn't right. Her face was expressionless, but her eyes, they were too intense to still, and when she looked at me, I felt a coldness wash over me, as if I had crossed some invisible boundary. The air around me seemed to tighten, and my breath caught in my throat. I couldn't move. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. I stood there paralyzed, staring back at her, and then she did something else. She took a step toward me, but it wasn't a normal step. It was like a slow, measured movement, as if every inch of her body was carefully calculating where to place her foot. She took another step, and then another, until she was standing just a few feet from me. My mind screamed at me to move, to run, but my body wouldn't respond. I couldn't take my eyes off her, couldn't tear myself away from that unblinking stare. Her presence felt like it was consuming the space around us, filling the air with something thick and suffocating, and then, just as suddenly as it had started, she was gone. One moment, she was standing in front of me, her figure towering over me, and the next she wasn't there. The street, which had felt so alive with the evening stillness, suddenly felt empty. The woman had vanished, as if the space where she had stood had swallowed her whole. I blinked, my mind struggling To make sense of what had just happened, I looked around, my heart racing in my chest. No one else was on the street. The bookstore stood at the corner just as it always had, and the streetlights hummed softly in the background, casting their yellow glow across the sidewalk. But the woman, she was gone. I stood there, frozen, unsure of what to do, my thoughts spinning in 1,000 different directions. Had I imagined her? Was it some kind of illusion? But no, I could still feel the coldness, the weight of her gaze pressing into me, as if it had never really left. Shaking, I turned and continued walking, my pace quickening as I moved away from the spot where she had been. The night felt different, now somehow more oppressive. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see her standing there again, waiting for me, but every time I turned, the street was empty, as it always had been. When I got home, I tried to shake it off. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, that I was tired or stressed, and that the strange encounter was nothing more than a trick of the mind. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face again, those cold, unblinking eyes, staring at me, waiting for me to make the next move, and I couldn't escape the feeling that I hadn't seen the last of her for days afterward. The unease never left me. I walked the same route home, always glancing at that corner by the bookstore. But I never saw her again, the woman who had been standing there waiting for something was gone. But sometimes when the wind picks up and the street is quiet again, I swear I feel her presence. I can almost hear the soft tap of her footsteps behind me, just a step too close, and when I turn to look, there's no one there, but I always feel her just over my shoulder, waiting. The rain had started to fall lightly, just as I reached the bridge, its thin, quiet patter adding to the calm of the evening. It was the kind of rain that doesn't seem to get anything wet at first, but as the minutes tick by, the world begins to feel damp, the air cool and fresh. I was walking home, after a long day, the kind of day that lingers in your bones, and makes you yearn for the comfort of your own space. I had walked this route 1,000 times before. This bridge, a familiar landmark that connected the old part of town with the newer areas on the other side. The bridge was an old stone structure, crumbling in places, its surface worn smooth by years of footsteps. The handrails, though still sturdy, had a weathered look to them, painted a faded green that had long since peeled and cracked. As I walked across, I felt that usual sense of familiarity, a strange comfort in the sound of my footsteps echoing softly against the stone, the mist curling around the bridge's edges as the rain continued to fall. I wasn't in any particular hurry, letting the quiet of the evening wash over me, the sound of the water flowing beneath the bridge blending with the soft rhythm of my steps. It was peaceful, almost meditative, but there was something unsettling about the silence. The world around me felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for something, or maybe it was just me, my mind tired and wandering, seeking comfort in the calm. When I reached the middle of the bridge, something made me stop. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled, and I glanced over my shoulder, unsure of why I had suddenly felt the need to look. The path behind me was still empty, the soft glow of the streetlights barely visible through the mist. The bridge stretched out behind me, and for a moment I thought I saw something, just a fleeting shadow that vanished before I could focus on it. I shook my head, dismissing the thought. It was just the rain, the mist playing tricks on my eyes. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It was too quiet, too still. I continued walking, my footsteps echoing louder now, the rhythmic sound of my own movement filling the air. But then something shifted. I heard another set of footsteps. At first I thought it was just my imagination, or maybe the sound of my own steps reverberating back to me. But no, the footsteps were real. They were soft, slow, almost cautious, but they were there, and they were behind me. My heart skipped a beat, and I stopped. Again glancing over my shoulder once more, the bridge stretched out behind me, empty. No one was there. I felt a cold chill crawl up my spine, a sudden unease that gnawed at the edges of my thoughts. I was alone. I had been alone on this bridge for as long as I could remember, and there was no one else around. But the footsteps continued, still soft, but unmistakable. I turned around almost instinctively and started walking faster, trying to ignore the rising panic in my chest. The footsteps kept pace with mine, still just behind me, just close enough to make me feel like I wasn't alone. I quickened my pace, hoping to outrun whatever was behind me, but the footsteps only grew louder, closer. It was like someone was walking just out of sight, trailing behind me, matching my every move. I glanced over my shoulder again, but this time the bridge was different. The scenery behind me had changed. The stone walls of the bridge, the railing, the river beneath, all of it was gone. Instead, I saw nothing but thick swirling fog rolling in from all directions. The bridge had disappeared. My stomach lurched. The footsteps hadn't stopped. They were still there, coming closer just behind me. My breath caught in my throat as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing, or rather what I wasn't seeing. The bridge was gone. The world had vanished behind me, replaced by an endless void of mist. I spun around, desperate to see anything familiar, but there was nothing, just the fog and the sound of those footsteps. Too close now. The air was cold, impossibly cold, and my heart was pounding in my chest as if trying to escape. I wanted to scream, but no sound came. My legs were frozen in place, as though I had stepped into something much darker than just the night air. And then I heard it, a voice, low, barely audible over the sound of the footsteps, but unmistakably there. "Why are you running?" The voice was calm, almost too calm, and yet it sent a jolt of fear through my body. I turned around again, but there was still no one behind me. The footsteps had stopped, and the fog seemed to close in tighter, wrapping around me like a suffocating blanket. I couldn't breathe. I took a step forward, hoping to escape the void that had replaced the bridge, but my feet felt heavy, as if I were walking through thick mud. Each step seemed to take longer, the ground beneath me shifting with every movement. The mist swirled around me, pulling at my thoughts, distorting everything. I couldn't tell which way I was going. I couldn't tell what was real anymore. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the fog began to clear. The bridge reappeared solid and real, stretching out before me in the same familiar way it had when I first walked onto it. The world once again seemed calm and still. The footsteps were gone. The strange voice was silent. I stood there, breathing heavily, my heart still pounding in my chest. Everything was back to normal. The bridge, the mist, the sound of the water beneath it, all seemed just as it had before, but something had changed. I wasn't sure what it was, whether it was the way the air felt heavier now, or how the silence seemed thicker, but I knew one thing: I wasn't alone, and I hadn't been for a long time. I walked off the bridge, my legs shaky beneath me, but every time I glanced over my shoulder, I could still hear the faintest echo of footsteps just behind me, always waiting.